Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we will explore the life of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's youngest First Lady, who, at age 21, married President Grover Cleveland, 28 years her senior, and captivated the nation with her charm and intellect. Known as Frank to loved ones, she embraced her unique role in the White House. Our guest, Annette B. Dunlap, author of Frank, The Story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's Youngest First Lady, reveals insights into this trailblazing figure's impact on society and enduring legacy. Join us for the fascinating story of this remarkable woman. I'd now like to welcome Annette Dunlap to our show. Welcome, Annette.
Thank you, James. Glad to be with you.
Well, we're very thankful because I am very interested in Grover Cleveland. I am a trustee at the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial Association here in Caldwell, New Jersey. So I actually live only, less than 2 miles from Grover Cleveland's birthplace. But I am really interested to hear more about Frances Folsom Cleveland. And you have written a book called Frank, The Story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's Youngest First Lady. But before we talk about the book, I want to talk about you, Annette. Is that okay?
All right.
Tell me two things. First of all, a little background about yourself, and also why you chose to write a biography about Frances Folsom Cleveland.
Okay, so I will answer the second question first. In the early 90s, we took our family to the White House over the Christmas season, and we toured. And in the process of that tour, we bought the books available through the White House Historical Association, one on our presidents and one on our first ladies. And as I was reading through the first ladies' books, I happened to pick up on the fact that Frances was 21 and Grover was 49 when they got married, that he was already in the White House when they wed, and that she was, even in the 90s, the nation's youngest First Lady, and that's still the case now in 2024, 25. So having somewhat of, I guess you could call it a semi-prurient interest in May-September marriages, I got interested in learning more about them as a couple and more about Frances as a person. I was able to take advantage of having access to an academic library and began reading on New York Times microfilm, which is the way things were stored back in the 90s, and got some interesting insights into their relationship and into the way the nation viewed her. And I was always interested in writing a biography. I had done freelance journalism for a number of years, and writing a book had been one of those bucket list items that I kept in the back of my head. Well, when I turned 50, that magic half-century age, and the reality hits that I am not getting any younger, and that if I'm serious about writing this book, I better get with the program. So I put the wheels in motion, and you have the book as a result of that. So that is how that book came to be. As far as my background, as I mentioned, writing is not my vocation, it's my avocation. I refer to it as my expensive hobby because I write nonfiction, and that requires research trips, which cost money. And I have just pursued it because I love writing, and I love writing about things that are of interest to me, but also things that don't get a lot of attention and press. So that is my background in a nutshell.
Well, I'm glad that you chose to go ahead and write this book because it is just filled with so much interesting history. And I could see the research because you've got letters in there that you must have had to really dig pretty deep to find. And it really tells a great story about this amazing First Lady. So history is something that's always been important to you. How did you develop that interest in history? Was that from as a little kid or later?
History was something that I enjoy, and it, of course, helped that I did well in it in school, so that encouraged me. But in our school library, we had some biographies, and we had three by a woman by the name of Ruth Painter Randall. And she wrote three biographies of women, two of whom we don't hear much about anymore, but the names of the books were I, Mary, which was about Mary Todd Lincoln, I, Jessie, which was about Jessie Benton Fremont, and I, Verena, which was about Verena Howell Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And as I mentioned, we don't hear a whole lot about Verena Davis, although Charles Frazier wrote a book about her a couple of years ago, and so she got a little bit of a blip on the press, and we barely ever hear anything anymore about Jessie Benton Fremont. But Mary Todd Lincoln, of course, still stays in the forefront of history for a number of reasons, both for her own things that she did as well as being married to the first president who was assassinated. But those books piqued my interest. They lit something in me, a small flame, and it just eventually grew into a larger fire.
Yeah, and when I did a little research on you before this interview, I hope you don't mind, but I did, and I found out that you actually wrote a book very early on in your life. Can you tell us about that one?
That book is about my younger sister, who was a bit of a, well, today we would call it a slob, but she was really, that's not fair to her because she was only I don't even think she was out of the toddler stage when I wrote it, but I called it Miss Messy of Messyville. And it was about her making a mess of things, although I had a happy ending. At the end of it, I said, well, she became Miss Neat. And she actually did. Years later, become Miss Neat. But that was the first book.
Excellent, excellent. Now, let's talk about Frances Folsom Cleveland. So, when I've read about her in the past, it seems like she would have been a very interesting person for the press to be covering at that time, as she would today, actually. But I want to really start with the beginning with her. What do we know about Frances's early life?
Because she was born in 1864, July 1864. Her parents were Emma and Oscar Folsom. Emma was Emma Harmon before she married, and they lived in Rochester, New York. Oscar was an attorney. He was actually law partners with Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland bought the couple the baby carriage for baby Frances, and she had a sister that had died. I cannot recall, or I do not know if it's really clear when that sister died, but I believe the sister died in infancy, and I want to say it was a younger sister. So she was raised as an only child. Just shortly after Frances's 11th birthday, so this would have been a week or so after she turned 11, her father was riding in a carriage, and he was coming up a hill. And there was a dray cart, and so that would have been a cart that would have had goods for sale on it. And kind of like we would think about an automobile backing out of a space, and you're coming up a hill and you sort of have a blind spot, and you can't see that that car is backing out, and that car can't see that you're coming up the hill. You kind of have that same scenario with what happened with Oscar Folsom. He's coming up the hill in his carriage. He was known for driving a little fast, so we might assume he was going faster than would have been safe. This cart is backing out. Oscar's horse rears, throws Oscar out of the carriage. The wheel from the carriage runs over him and essentially crushes him, and he dies a few hours later after the accident. So that leaves Emma widowed and Frances, in the terminology of the day, orphaned. Oscar was not a good money manager, and he was a bit of a gambler. So his financial affairs were in disarray. The situation was not a good one. And Grover had since broken up the partnership with Oscar, but had remained friends. But Grover was a more orderly kind of person, and it was just a little difficult for him to be a law partner with Oscar Folsom. But Grover stepped in to help get Emma back on a solid footing. And what's a real curiosity is that back in 1875, when this happened, is you generally had a man appointed as guardian and overseer over a widow and her children. But this was not the case. So that is a misconception that has sometimes been fostered in the writings about the relationship between Frances and Grover, that she was his ward. I found no evidence for that, and pretty strong evidence that that's not what happened. What I did find is that he remained a friend of Emma Folsom and a friend with Frances, helped the family. But it's also important to understand that over the next several years, because of the sort of iffy financial situation, Emma and Frances moved a lot. They moved in with Oscar's father for a couple of years. They then moved to Jackson, Michigan, where Emma's sister lived. That was a short time because there were marital problems and marital issues in that house. So Emma and Frances came back. They resettled in Buffalo. And I did misspeak earlier. I said she was born in Rochester. That's incorrect. She was born in Buffalo. But her father was originally from Rochester. So they returned to Buffalo. And about that time, and it may have been, we could analyze it today in 21st century terms, but Frances was not doing well in school. And what would today we would say she probably had some psychological issues undoubtedly related to these moves, to the financial stress with her mother, with the grieving with her father being gone, and a lot of uncertainty in her growing up. So this is where we see Grover stepping in and suggesting that instead of Frances going ahead and fully finishing high school, he knew the founder of Wells College, and he was able to get Frances admitted as a student. And that was probably a very, very smart move. If you look at her grades, she was nearly a straight A student the whole time she was there. She proved to be very smart, and she really thrived at Wells. And this was a small college. It had just gotten started. Her graduating class was 6 people, but this was where she needed to be, and it worked out very well.
Would it have been very unusual for a woman at that time to go to college?
Absolutely. This is when women's colleges were really just starting to take off. You had a kind of early version of that, which were called women's seminaries. The idea being that this was beyond what the education would have been in a woman's boarding school, and this would have been another level of education. But to step the education up where you're now teaching foreign languages, where you're now teaching mathematics, subjects that in that era you would think a woman would have no use for, but it was the idea of preparing her to be a good wife and a good mother to be able to nurture her children. That was the underlying rationale that was given for a lot of these, what would become 4-year women's colleges, to get started. And it was a step toward a more educated population. So yes, her attending college was very unusual. There's some question as to whether or not she was the first lady to graduate from a 4-year school, which is what I maintain in the book. There is some evidence that Lucy Hayes, Rutherford Hayes' wife, may have actually attended a 4-year school. That's still kind of iffy, and I have done some work on that and some research on that, and I haven't found anything that makes me 100% comfortable with retracting what I've said about Frances being the first lady with a 4-year college education. But there is some information out there that would suggest that that's incorrect now.
Yeah, now you mentioned about that being a really rough time for Frances. I think certainly it would be. She was 11 years old. Her father was killed suddenly in a terrible accident. And do we know anything about the relationship she had with her father in her first 11 years of life?
I was not able to find anything about him. So the most I was able to find about him is not necessarily positive. He seems to have left a reputation of being a little bit of a rogue, loose with his finances, possibly loose in other ways. There's not a lot of positive information about him. So it's uncertain what that relationship with her father was. And in the correspondence that I was able to read between Emma and Frances after Frances marries, and then, of course, after Emma remarries, because she does remarry after Frances marries Grover Cleveland, I had not seen any discussion about Oscar at all. No allusions from Emma to Frances about your father this or your father that. So there's no real hard information about what that relationship may have looked like.
Yeah, but there was certainly that instability of moving around and finances and all that was involved in that were certainly going to be negative towards, how a child feels in regard to security and things like that. It must have affected her a lot.
I would agree with that, and I think that's what we need to look at, regardless of what Oscar's reputation may or may not have been. Mm-hmm. The thing that I believe is important to recall is that there was a man in the house that was critical for that time period. Of course, it's still critical today, but very important in that time period for legal recognition, signing of any legal documents, transacting any business, having the socially recognized leadership of a home. And without that individual in the house, that father and husband in the house, it does make things very difficult. I think it's important to note that this is not an era where a widowed woman could go out and find a job. This was not like a woman who may have been trained as a teacher or a nurse or any profession that a woman might have followed into, and having dropped out of the workforce to have a family and then re-enters. I mean, we're not looking at that kind of lifestyle at this time. We're looking at the fact that short of taking in boarders or doing mending for people, there was very little open to Emma for her to earn some kind of living.
Yeah. Now, when Frances does go to Wells College, what do we know about her college years? I know you said that I think she did pretty well academically, but do we know about her? What do we know about her personality? What can you tell us?
She developed real leadership skills while she was at Wells. As I said, this was where she had an opportunity to blossom. Of course, she's in a class with 6. Excuse me. It's not hard for somebody to blossom, but you're always going to have people that are going to have more leadership skills than others. And Frances was very much in that leadership role. But the other thing that's important for Frances's story is the relationship that she developed with Helen Fairchild Smith. And that was the woman who was, the title she had at the time was Lady Principal. Today we would call it the Dean of Students. And Helen saw it as her responsibility to inculcate these women with the values that would make them strong wives and strong mothers and assume leadership roles within the woman's sphere. This is the time when there was believed to be 2 spheres, the woman's sphere and the men's sphere. And the woman stayed home and maintained the hearth and maintained purity of home. And the men went out and did all the dirty work. They engaged in business. They engaged in politics. They made the money. But then they would come home to this well-maintained, well-run home with this loving wife and children. But the wife was also somebody who could be an intellectual partner for the husband. And that is the ethos that Helen inculcated into these women, or these girls who became women, while they were at Wells. And that was a message that she drummed into Frances, and actually continued to drum into Frances after Frances married Grover Cleveland and became First Lady.
Oh, so she continued to be an influence.
Very strong, yes.
So let's talk about how the relationship between Grover Cleveland, who at this time, let's think about him. He went from sheriff of Erie County, he became mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, and then president of the United States in pretty short order. It went pretty quickly. And he's, during this time, he's been, helping with the family, helping with Frances and her mother, Emma. But what about the relationship between Grover and Frances during this time? How did it sort of go from, I'm helping the family out to a romantic interest?
Well, that's interesting. And of course, nobody ever really knows why somebody is attracted to someone else. That's just chemistry, if you want to call it that, pheromones, if you want to take a scientific approach to it. What we do know is that Frances had been dating a Presbyterian seminary student, and it looked like that relationship was headed toward an engagement, and that Emma discouraged that relationship, discouraged the engagement, and I think, and this is just my reading into it and my opinion because I have nothing to prove it, I think Grover was kind of behind that possibly as well, because I think he had started to get interested in Frances from a romantic standpoint. And there's a curious letter that he wrote to his sister, Susan. She was nagging him to get married, and he wrote back that he was waiting for his sweetheart to grow up. And it has always been assumed that he has been referring to Frances in that letter. The other interesting thing in that regard is that there's an interesting article in the Washington Post where both Emma and Frances are visiting the White House, and at that time, Grover's sister is youngest sister is serving as his hostess, and so they are assisting her at a reception, and the Washington Post enumerates all of these women who were there to assist in this reception. And then Grover allegedly comments after reading the article, and there's a suggestion that he may be romantically interested to this woman or that woman, and he allegedly makes the comment, "I don't know why they keep wanting to match me up with the older women all the time." And so it's kind of this hint that he's got interest in Frances. What we know with certainty is that all men who were not blood relatives of the students at Wells, who wanted to have written correspondence with these students, were required to have parental permission to write a woman at Wells. So Grover would have asked Emma if it would be okay with her if he wrote to Frances. So we know that those two corresponded. But we also know that Grover had a special rail car that came into Aurora, which is where Wells College was located, and he would come in to visit Frances on a regular basis, and he routinely sent her flowers. So there was no secret that she had a relationship with the governor of New York and the future president of the United States.
Okay, so what do we know about the feelings that Frances had about this, famous person who was almost kind of a father figure to her over the years, quite a bit older? She's a young woman, a very pretty woman, very well-liked person. What do we know about her feelings for him? How did they, sort of transform into a place where she was willing to accept a proposal of marriage?
Not a whole lot, other than she did not discourage his suit. Mm-hmm. She was present with him when they were listening to the returns from the presidential election of 84. Mm-hmm. She had political opinions where she occasionally wrote or made comments about things that would be in a local newspaper that she agreed or disagreed with. She was astute about the political scene. And that she visited the White House with her mother, which would have only been the right and proper thing to do, always under the guise of visiting his sister, not him. But he would make time to spend time alone with her. There's discussion about them taking walks in the East Room of the White House, and that is presumably where he ultimately did propose to her, and she accepted his proposal. So we can only assume that this was comfortable to her, that it was all right, that she had feelings for him, or perhaps she was simply a very practical person who recognized that this was going to give her the financial security that she had not had in her childhood and in her teen years. As you know, James, none of us knows at the end of the day why somebody has married somebody else.
Wasn't there some talk that Grover was maybe going to marry Frances's mother, Emma?
Yes. There was definite discussion that his interest was actually in Emma, not in Frances. There is some hint that Emma was jealous of Grover's interest in Frances and was unhappy that he chose Frances over her. So, again, some of this is speculation. We don't have a lot of certainty on that.
You mentioned about Grover proposing to Frances in the White House. I thought there was a letter that he sent to propose. Was that in addition to the in-person?
Yes, you're correct. There was a letter that he wrote to her, and she accepted it through letter, but there was also a time when they spent alone in one of the rooms of the White House, walking and talking, and there is the suggestion that he posed the idea of marriage to her there and would have followed up with the letter. Back to your question about Frances's feelings, one of the reasons we do not know about her feelings is that Frances bequeathed her correspondence with Grover to her youngest son, Frances Grover Cleveland, with the instructions that he was either to pass it on to the next generation or to burn the letters, but that they were not to be disseminated to the public. Frances Grover hung on to them. When it was discovered he had them, I believe it was the Smithsonian may have discovered it, or Library of Congress. They asked him to donate them. He said no, that was not his mother's instructions. He was going to honor her instructions. I believe he gave those letters to his daughter, Marion Cleveland Cohen. She has since passed away. And so those letters may have been destroyed. And if they are no longer in the family, then we will never really know what her responses were to Grover or how the relationship developed over those 4 years that she was at Wells.
So when Frances accepts the proposal, how long is the period between the acceptance and the wedding itself? Do you remember that?
It's roughly a year.
Mm-hmm.
She graduates in June of 85. And then she goes off on a European tour with her mother and a cousin. Her grandfather, her Folsom grandfather, gives her money to purchase a trousseau. And she purchases quite the trousseau. She has items from Worth of Paris. Worth was actually an Englishman who moved to Paris to start designing, and he is one of the designers who is credited with the development of what we today call haute couture. Mm-hmm. So his clothing was exquisitely designed, beautifully made, and so she came home with gorgeous clothes and ready to go for the next step, which was going to be marriage. So the way it worked out is they embarked in July of 85. She returns roughly around what today we call Memorial Day, end of May. It was Decoration Day at the time, was what it was known by. She's met by Daniel Lamont, who is kind of Grover's, if you will, personal secretary, administrative, head of the administration, what we would call today the chief of staff, so to speak. He gets the party, the cousin and Emma and Frances, into a hotel. Hints start to come out that she has arrived because Grover announces over the weekend that he is planning to marry and that he is marrying Miss Frances Folsom. So they're in New York. He comes to see her. Then they travel to Washington the morning of the wedding. This is unreal. I just cannot believe doing this. But Grover's sister has really gotten all the preparations ready, the flowers, the cake, all of this. And Frances spends a little bit of time with Grover, and this is June 2nd, 1886, and they get married in the Blue Room of the White House that evening.
So how much time was there between when the press or the country found out about this upcoming wedding, and the actual wedding?
I'm going to say roughly 5 days. The wedding was on a Wednesday.
Wow. As we'll find out with another situation, the Clevelands were pretty good at keeping stuff from the press, weren't they?
Well, Grover had this little issue during the 1884 campaign.
Yeah, right.
Where he's accused of fathering a child out of wedlock, and they attempt to make it enough of the opposition attempts to make it enough of a campaign issue to say that he's not worth being elected. And there's a political cartoon that was drawn after his election that goes, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" And the response is, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." And so Grover already knew what the press could or could not do. So there was a lot of effort to conceal the relationship during the entire time it was developing, but to conceal their wedding plans. And the other piece of this is that Grover has got the typical male view of the time period, which is you are the protector of the women. So he doesn't want Frances to become this national, what we would call today a commodity. Mm-hmm. And he wants privacy, not at all unusual for any newlywed, regardless of their position or age. But that ended up not being what was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, I think what I know the Maria Halpin thing I was going to bring up, because I was going to ask you, I wonder what Frances's thoughts were on that revelation about the man that she was about to marry. Did she have any thoughts? And I know there was other thoughts about her father being the actual father in this case with Maria Halpin.
Right, and I think it's quite possible that Oscar was actually the father. But the other side of it is, not to get too crude or anything, you're a bachelor and women make themselves available. Who really knows? I guess that's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, who knows? But Grover Cleveland he was supporting this child. He did take responsibility. And when the press did find out about it, he certainly, he just said to just tell the truth is what he said, right? Right.
But as we know from something later on, that didn't necessarily mean that the truth. It may have been the version of the truth they wanted to get out.
Yeah, I think the other thing that the main thing I was referring to is what happens later on, which maybe we could jump there real quickly. I think it was during Cleveland's second administration, is when he had a serious health issue that was really, really covered up and kept from the press, right?
Yes. He was discovered in May of 1893 he found a soft spot in his mouth that bothered him, and he went to have it looked at, and the dentist or the oral surgeon biopsied it and had it sent off, and it came back that it was cancer. And so it was important to go ahead and have that surgery performed as quickly as possible. At the same time, you're having a run on the Treasury because of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which allowed people to exchange their silver for gold or for banknotes. And people were, as the price of silver was beginning to drop, people exchanged the silver that they were holding for gold. It actually depleted the United States Treasury of gold, and Grover had to arrange a loan of gold from none other than J.P. Morgan himself, who pretty much you talk about bailouts. J.P. Morgan bailed out the U.S. government in 1893 from it going bankrupt. But Cleveland needed to work with Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And in the middle of trying to make this happen, this soft spot, this cancerous growth has been discovered. And so now he requires surgery. So they do this very clandestine surgery out on a yacht owned by Commodore Benedict. And the surgery is performed. Everybody is sworn to secrecy. The word out to the press is he's gone on a fishing trip. Then after the surgery is performed and it's safe for him to get off the yacht, he goes, but he's accompanied by his personal physician. They go to their summer home where Frances already is. And by the way, she's pregnant with their second child, who is going to be due the beginning of September. That will be Esther Cleveland. And they have Ruth. And so Grover arrives at Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts. He is not seen by the public, so you get more rumors going out. The story actually broke that he had cancer. They managed to hush it up and say that he just has rheumatism. They were able to fit his mouth in such a way that if he spoke, you couldn't tell that he had part of his jaw removed, some of his teeth removed. They ultimately put in a rubber prosthesis so that it filled out his face and he was able to talk normally. But yes, it was a huge, huge, huge cover-up. And when the story finally broke in the end of August by a reporter from the Philadelphia Ledger, the Cleveland administration went to work completely and totally discrediting this man. And he was scandalized by his own peers for making up this story, and he could not get a job in journalism at all. And it wasn't until 30 years later that one of the dentists who had been involved in the operation wrote a story for the Saturday Evening Post, and if I recall correctly, he got permission from Frances to go ahead and submit the story, and it was because he felt guilty about what had happened to that reporter. But of course, by that time, that man was probably well into his 50s, if not 60s. But he was still living when the story broke, and then everybody starts to give him all of this kudos for what a wonderful job he had done, way too late. But yes, that is the story behind the cover-up for his operation.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds, I'm just speculating, I mean, it sounds like the whole cover-up was really so that there wouldn't be panic and economic panic that would take place, that the President of the United States' health was compromised during this, particularly sensitive economic situation, right?
Exactly. And, if we really think about the history of the country to that point, you've got two assassinations that have occurred prior to this. You've got Lincoln's assassination and you've got Garfield's assassination. But other than that, it's really hard for us to know if there were any other presidents who were significantly unwell or who may have had a serious health issue that would have had potential negative ramifications or negative repercussions for the public. So this may well have been the first time, and as you point out, the country was in horrible economic shape and dire straits. It was important to show that there was a strong and capable person at the helm. The panic was already, it was called the Panic of 1893, so it was already going on, And it was important that there was an exhibition of leadership, that there was a way to get it stopped. So there were a lot of little pieces that go into that cover-up.
Yeah, I've got it. Well, I jumped ahead there a bit, but I just want to go back to the new First Lady. She's 21 years old. It seems like she's very full of life. Can you tell us about what she was like as First Lady? I know she was only First Lady for just a little while, I guess, in the first term. Was it for 2 years? Then Cleveland was defeated by Benjamin Harrison, so they were out of the White House. What was it like, that first little taste of being First Lady, and then, of course, transition that into that down period when I think she had her first child in between terms, right? Baby Ruth?
Right. Ruth is born in 1891, and that's after they have left the White House. They leave the White House in March of 89. So if your listeners are not aware, the inauguration date used to be March 4th. And during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, it's either the third term or fourth term, the date was moved to January 20th. So they left. She was First Lady from June of 86 until March of 89.
And what was that period like for her first taste of First Lady?
She fit in very well, and certainly there was some apprehension on the part of Grover, and allegedly or apparently based on Emma kind of hanging around for a little while on the part of her mother to get her eased in. His sister gracefully departs, which she probably wanted to do anyway. She was an academic. She had her own interests. She wanted to go back to teaching and to writing. So she kind of leaves the scene. But you also have people that are helping Frances. Flora Whitney, who was the wife of the Secretary of the Navy, William Whitney, takes Frances under her wing a little bit to help introduce her to Washington society, give her education and instruction on the social mores of Washington, particularly when it involves the First Lady and the women who are the wives of the men who are in government. One that I didn't learn about until after I had worked on the book and had it published was that Harriet Lane Johnston, the niece of James Buchanan, who served as his First Lady during Buchanan's 4 years in the White House, had returned to Washington, and she actually also served somewhat as a social mentor for Frances. So Frances is extremely popular. She gets a lot of press attention, both positive and negative. Her image is used in advertising, which drives Grover completely up the wall, and keeps trying to get Congress to pass legislation that will prevent the images of personages being used in advertising unless they have given express permission. The problem with getting that passed was that Grover was really not, in spite of his success with being elected, he was not the best negotiator or politician, and there were people in the White House in Congress, who voted against that more to spite him than because they didn't want to see the legislation go through. It was just a way to get back at him for his innumerable vetoes of legislation and the difficulties that they had with him agreeing with their stances. So a couple of the things that she does that are remarkable is, number one, she changes when White House teas put on by the First Lady are held. So the White House was way more public than it is now. Of course, now it's guarded like a fortress. But the White House at that time was open to the public. I mean, like really open. There is a drawing of people gathered around the outside of the White House watching the Cleveland's wedding ceremony through the windows of the White House. And this is just the public that's gathered and massed there on the White House grounds. You did not have ushers. You did not have guards. Anybody could walk in. So there was an attempt to control some of that traffic, but there were also public teas that were open to the public to come and see the president or see the first lady. And Frances had sensitivity to these women who had started working as shop clerks and in the newly created department stores and some of the other positions where women were starting to fill. And so she started to have these Saturday teas in order for these working women to have an opportunity to come and meet her and say they had been to the White House to see the First Lady. And she gets pushback from Lamont about doing it, and she sticks to her guns. So she had these Wednesday and Saturday teas, and she held those through the first term that she was there, those 2+ years that she was in the First Lady's position.
Right. Now, her husband loses to Benjamin Harrison, and during that 4-year period, they start having a family together. Do we know anything about her frame of mind during that period? Grover is no longer president. What is Grover doing during that 4-year period?
So they moved to New York City, as you mentioned. They have Ruth in 1891, and then their second child, Esther, won't be born until September of 93 after they're back in the White House. Mm-hmm. So there's there's a little vignette in the book by the White House usher, Ike Hoover, which at the time that I read that and put that in the book, I didn't know much about this book. But the vignette that I put in the book was that she claims that she told Hoover and the other White House staff to leave things exactly as they were because they would be back, the Clevelands would be back in 4 years. There's now some thought that may have been contrived on his part. So just a little aside on that book, I wrote the biography of Lou Henry Hoover. Mm-hmm. And the Hoovers were in office from 1929 to 1933. Hoover's book comes out in either 34 or 35. Lou Henry Hoover and Grace Coolidge are very close friends, and there is quite a bit of correspondence between the two of them when this book comes out. And both women are aghast at some of the things that he wrote and discuss that it does not sound like him. And it should be noted that the book was printed posthumously. Hoover had submitted a manuscript, but the book does not get published until after he passes. And both Hoover and Coolidge, Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Coolidge, speculate that somebody went in there and doctored some of these stories in order to make the book more appealing to the public. And I have some thought that might be the case with the Frances story. So I would like your readers just to be aware of that when they read that in my book. So back to, Frances and the White House. The other thing that she's getting involved in is Wells College in 1887 appoints her as a trustee of the college. And really it is just for publicity purposes, but she takes this position very seriously. And she meets then Richard Watson Gilder. Gilder is another one of those people in American history that really should be studied. He was a tastemaker in terms of literature. He was the editor of Century and Scribner's magazines. He published stories from people like Stephen Crane, Bret Harte. He put a lot of authors on the map, and he also, in some ways, helped to mold American literary taste. Frances is so impressed with him that she invites him back to the White House to meet Grover. These two men are roughly the same age, and they hit it off. And Frances and Gilder hit it off. And Gilder's wife is Helene Decay Gilder, and she helped to found the Arts Student League. So she is an artist of note. So you've got these two people who are involved in the arts community, both in literature and in visual arts, and Frances gets into that milieu, and that is where she thrives. I mean, these are her people, and this is part of who she is. Talk about blossoming at Wells. This allows her to blossom even more. And this is a closet thing about Grover Cleveland, is he's got this exterior gruff persona. I mean, this is a man who literally burned the midnight oil, going over word for word legislation and vetoing legislation just based on one sentence because he thought it wasn't right or didn't fit right. I mean, he's that much of we would call it today a nitpicker, but there are people and writers who see that as a mark of somebody who really understood how there could be government overreach. And he was one who was against government overreach and looked for reasons to prevent it. And that was his way of looking to prevent it. And yet, in private, he was a heck of a raconteur. He loved the theater. He became friends with Joseph Jefferson, again, through the Gilder connection. This is why they end up in Buzzards Bay, because of Gilder, because of Jefferson. And so they're summering with some of the top literati in the country at the time. Jefferson is just a world-renowned actor. You've got the Gilders, and there are others there. They get to know Mark Twain personally. And this is kind of like their private life that doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And to be honest, James, if I ever thought I could get a revision of this book published, I would really like to highlight that more, because that's something that really, I missed that in the first round of research. So Gilder comes back. Frank gets ensconced in this world. Grover gets ensconced in this world when he leaves Washington. And so one of the things that happens is there's issues with the copyright law. And American authors are not protected because we do not have a copyright law. So that means that their work, American authors' works, can get published overseas, and they don't have, and royalties do not have to be paid to these authors. So Frank is now taking a political stand to sit in and listen to congressional debates about what's going on with the copyright, and having dinners, events at the White House with the Gilders there, an attempt to promote copyright legislation being passed. So that's where she's politically active, and we don't hear that much about her doing that, but she is doing that behind the scenes, and eventually there is a copyright law that is passed.
Yeah, so she was getting involved during their 4 years out of office. She was getting involved in things like that, and then brought it into the second term as well when she was First Lady, right?
Right. And then the other thing she was bringing in is she got very interested in the kindergarten movement, in the idea of early education of children. And so she begins to work with that, with other women who are trying to promote kindergartens, to push the creation of kindergartens when she's back in the White House, to push them in Washington, D.C. She has a kindergarten there in the White House for Ruth. So we think Jackie Kennedy is the first one. She really isn't. It's Frances Folsom Cleveland. So that is another area where Frances is doing some work that she doesn't get a lot of credit for. So
she seems to be very active in things that she's very interested in, and she's very popular. And at this point, though, there may be some speculation, or there were some accusations that she wasn't happy, that Grover wasn't the best husband, that she was maybe depressed, or perhaps she carried some old depression from her, turbulent early years when her father died and all that. Is there any truth to that you know of?
I think there are some hints of that. You get a sense of that in their early years of their marriage, when they had the house at what was called Red Top. It was in what's now known as the Cleveland Park section of Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And that was the area where a lot of the government people had homes for the Clevelands. This was their getaway from the White House. And there were diplomats and members of the cabinet who had homes in this section of Washington. And there is some indication that Frances gets tired of Grover spending so much time going line by line over legislation to either decide he's going to sign it or he's going to veto it. And so, yes, there is a hint that there is some unhappiness there. Some of that I kind of put to, unfortunately, when we marry, we will eventually, after we've put on our good face for the person that we have been dating and get engaged to, we're going to eventually revert to whoever we really are. And so the other person's going to have to either, the morning you wake up and you look in the mirror and go, what have I gotten myself into? She apparently had that moment, and she has to figure out what she's going to do with it, and she does successfully, to her credit.
I understand that, Grover, he was a really hard worker. It was, you may want to call him what today you would say maybe a workaholic. He was, his integrity was very important, and he was a really hard worker. And I understand though that when he and Frances had started having children, that he started to change a little bit there in a very good way with regard to how he felt about having his own children. Can you talk about how the start of the family affected the two of them?
Yes, he definitely softened up. Now, that doesn't mean that he completely abandoned his work ethic, and it also doesn't mean that it shifted in the sense of the spheres of influence. Frances was still the primary caretaker. She has a letter to one friend where she writes about how important it is to keep the baby from crying because she referred to him in this letter as GC because it would upset GC. He didn't want to be disturbed. So you do have some of that, which I put down to the combination of his age, getting older, and it's difficult as you get older to listen to crying children. I mean, that's just a fact of life. Mm-hmm. And then also, still when he was in the presidency, he did have responsibilities. And again, he really wasn't all that well. We know that. He already had the cancer in his mouth. He does have rheumatism. He's got other health issues that are most likely tied to his weight as well as his age. Yet at the same time, yes, there's definitely this softening. There's this greater level of tenderness expressed. I think it was there all the time. I think that having children gave him the freedom to express it.
Yeah. Now, Cleveland's second term was marked with a financial problem, a big financial downturn in 1893, and then almost, I guess, well into his second term. And I know Cleveland's, maybe his popularity dipped at that point. As far as how the country viewed Frances Folsom Cleveland, maybe she didn't get credit for all the philanthropy and the work she was doing with children and women. How did her popularity fare during the time that maybe his popularity was dropping?
She was more popular than he was, but it was not at the same height that it had been during the first term. And it's important to recognize that she has, make sure I got my math right here, she has 3 children during the time that she is in the White House. She's got Esther, who was born in 93, Marion is born in 95, and Richard was born in 97. Mm-hmm. So she's pregnant when they come in March of 93, and she gives birth right before, I got to do my math real quick. I think she would have been pregnant before they were leaving. Yeah. Because it would have been March of 97 when McKinley's inaugurated and Richard's born in October of 97. So you have 3 pregnancies, 2 children born, a third one on the way. She had other things that she was preoccupied with, obviously. It's also important to note that there was a kidnapping scare regarding Ruth and Esther. And this is something else that I am very upset about because I had the research and somehow or another it got left out of the book. But telephones were installed in the White House at that time, but Frank gets this notification that, Grover wants to see the children, and she contacts him back and says, did you send me this that you wanted to, want the children to come out? And he contacted her back and said, no, I haven't done anything like this. And they start to kind of check into what's going on, and they realize that somebody's attempting to kidnap the two girls. So these are not good 4 years. This is one of those times where probably they would have done better to have made. He had a life in New York with a law firm, and he was making good money. He was counsel for railroads. He was doing well. They probably would have done better not to have gone back in. But he gets drafted, so to speak, by the Democratic Party, and he does the same state that kept him out of the consecutive term, puts him back in for the non-consecutive term. But it's time to say goodbye.
Now, let's talk about the years after their second term in office there and his death, which I think is 1908.
Yes, June of 08.
Yeah. So what are those years like, particularly after the loss of baby Ruth?
Right. So it's important to recognize they have relocated to Princeton, and they become just absolutely beloved by the student body on the campus. And they get to interact with professors there. The intellect, again, this sort of hidden side of Grover Cleveland, but this intellectual milieu, the interaction with younger students, it works really well for Grover, the respect that he gets. It works well for Frances. But then Ruth, so you have Frances Grover, their last child, their fifth child, who was born in July of 03. And Ruth dies in January of 04 from diphtheria. And what makes that painful on so many levels is because of Frances taking care of Frances Grover, the nurse will not let her in the room while Ruth is dying for fear that Frances will contract diphtheria and give it to the baby. So she is not even there when her daughter dies. Grover cannot handle it. There is a very painful note that he writes, and his handwriting, you can tell he is crying. His script is shaky. This has really taken the wind out of both their sails, and Grover perhaps even more so than Frances. Not that she didn't grieve; they both did, but his grief is way more palpable. Publicly, we're kind of able to pick up on the fact of how more palpable it was from the way that he corresponds with people like Mark Twain, for example, about his feelings about this. And, this goes back to what you brought up a little while ago about having children softening him. And this reaction is part of what has happened. More or less, most of us mellow with age, and he's certainly one of the ones that this has happened to. So you have this, love and devotion of his oldest child, and you have her loss from an ailment, a disease that at that time we had no vaccine for, and it would occur in waves. So you had potential epidemics of diphtheria outbreaks, and then it claimed one of their children. And yes, it was horrible. It was a really rough time.
Tragic, and it resulted in them actually selling one of their homes, right? Because it was too painful, the memories from it.
Right. They sell Buzzards Bay, and then they end up buying a place in Tamworth, New Jersey.
Now, so Grover passes in 1908. We said that before, but you've got Frances is now a very young woman. I guess she's in her mid-40s, and she's got 4 children, and because one has passed. And she is still a very active person. She's still very involved in philanthropy. Tell us about what goes on there. She's known as the first lady to remarry after her husband's passing.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Frances continues her work as a trustee of Wells College, and in the course of that, she meets the professor of art and architecture. His name is Thomas Jex, Jex Preston, and he's a junior. He's from New Jersey. He also is from the Princeton area. There's a little vignette that says that she got him this teaching position at Wells so she could keep an eye on him. So, we're not sure whether or not that story is true, but it's a nice little vignette. It's kind of cute. And they court and they get engaged, and then Preston goes to turn in his resignation to the president of Wells College and explains to the president that Preston had been living in a space on campus. Mm-hmm. And he turns in his resignation explaining that he is about to get married and he can't live in the place that's been provided for him on the campus. And the president says, well, there are rooms that are above so-and-so's store right there in Aurora. If anybody's been to Aurora, it's the campus and it's one main street. It's a very tiny town. And so Preston says, I'm marrying Mrs. Grover Cleveland. I can't live above this store. And so his resignation, of course, is accepted. The two basically elope. They get married and then they go off to Florida and they establish a home there in Dunedin, Florida. Mm-hmm. And apparently there's material down there, again, material that's, when the internet, I hope your listeners will understand, I wrote this book before the internet became a force. So some of the things that are now out there that are way easier to find were not available to me. Mm-hmm. So don't be too hard on me if you know something about her and wonder why it's left off.
Oh, I won't. Oh, absolutely not.
Or your readers either. But they summered there, and apparently there's also, archival information about that, which unfortunately, again, has been not gone through.
To your knowledge, were they happy?
Yes, it was, it's a second marriage between, now, Preston had never been married before, so he may have been in for a shock when he found out what married life was like. But they stayed together till she died. She died in 47. So, yes, one of the things that's very interesting is Frances becomes politically active, and I always had these visions when I was reading about her political activity during World War I about Grover rolling over his grave because she was out making talks about the importance of Army readiness. And they were in Europe when World War I broke out.
Yes.
And Emma was with them. She had been recently widowed from her husband. And they were, I believe, in France, may have been in England. But Preston had been doing research in Germany. So he is behind enemy lines. And they will not let him out. She has got to work some of the connections that Frances had to work some of the connections that she had because she had been a first lady to get him released and back on the other side. And that actually makes her, and then she would have been aware of the atrocities of the invasion of Belgium. And she was fluent in German. There's actually in the Library of Congress archives a story she wrote entirely in German. But she becomes very anti-German. And part of her talk is the anti-German. She feeds into that anti-German feeling that surfaces as a result of their invasion of France, their invasion of Belgium, and the start of the war. It should be noted that Esther was over there doing volunteer work, and she met somebody, and she married this person, and she stayed in England until her husband died, and then she came back to the U.S. Yeah, so Frances stays very active with war readiness. She's corresponding with Theodore Roosevelt during this time because he's pushing that as well. He tells her she would have made a good Republican. When the suffrage movement gets more vocal and more organized, she actually becomes the second vice president of the New Jersey Association for Anti-Suffrage. But ironically, once suffrage was passed, she voted. But it was very curious because in the 1940 election, she wrote her children that she was voting for the Republican candidate. And she said, your father meaning Grover, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Your father never said that somebody should serve a third term. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So she continues on.
Yeah, to think that she died in 1947. I mean, that's just a little over a decade before I was born. So it's like and yet she goes back to you think of the 1880s and that period. But it is interesting to note that Frances, she did not agree with women's suffrage, and yet she was extremely active and vocal. She was not a shrinking violet, shall we say. She was, she said what was on her mind. And do you have any thoughts as to, was it really back to the education she got at Wells, sort of the old 19th century education of women then, as to what was appropriate for a young woman of her caliber to do in the case of suffrage?
Yes, I do. And I'll throw in here that it was also a class thing. Upper class women were generally not in favor of suffrage. Mm-hmm. Helen Taft, William Howard Taft's wife, mm-hmm. was not in favor of suffrage. Her reasoning was that women were not prepared yet. They needed to be educated in order to vote. An interesting take, but that was hers. So some of it was just being in the upper class, okay. Which by this time Frances is, as well as you suggest the values inculcated at Wells.
Right. And again, we all have to remember the times that they lived in. And right. Again, what class you were part of then was important, but she certainly did a lot of wonderful things, and she lived on to past the end of World War II. So that's really incredible. So if you had to sort of summarize what you think about the legacy of Frances Folsom Cleveland, that somebody maybe interested in picking up the book and learning more about her, what if you had to summarize what it is about her that you think sort of lives on and inspires you?
Well, that is a good question. And, two things that I think are remarkable. The first is how she stepped into the role as First Lady at the age of 21. It's a very high-pressure job. I wrote that book when my daughters were in their late teens, and I could not have envisioned either of them having that responsibility on their shoulders. And my daughters are responsible, intelligent women, but that's a tough job. And Frances stepped into it just absolutely beautifully. And whatever flaws or mistakes she made, she was so popular at the time, nobody was paying attention to her benefit. The other would be that once she finished grieving Grover's death, she did want to maintain his legacy. She worked with various biographers who were putting books out about him. She had a hand in at least two of the biographies that came out. One shortly after his death by McElroy, and then the one by Nevins that came out, I want to say it was in 32, that won a Pulitzer Prize. She had a hand in both of those, both in terms of providing material and in also being available as a resource. So she was there to protect her husband's legacy, but she also created her own life. She did not let the rest of her years revolve around his memory. She moved on. And that has something that every woman who loses a spouse, regardless of your age, ultimately has to face and decide. And men have to do it too when they lose their spouse. So she gets credit for that, for continuing on and I think becoming more of who she really was as she got older.
Well said. And a really wonderful, well-researched book, Frank, the story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's youngest First Lady, by Annette Dunlap. I know the book's been out for a while, but please look it up, get a copy of it. It's a great read. particularly if you're interested in that sort of Gilded Age period and first ladies, because remember, the first ladies, there's some really interesting first ladies out there. Dolly Madison, Martha Washington being the first lady, of course, Jackie Kennedy, many others, tremendous, inspirational, hardworking people who were in a difficult spot, particularly in different ages in history. Different expectations were out there at the time, but you've done a tremendous job. If you could just real briefly tell us that there's 2 other books that you've written. One is about another first lady by the name of Lou Hoover, who you mentioned before. Can you tell us about that real quick?
Sure. So Lou Henry Hoover is another one of these undersung first ladies. I write that off to the lack of popularity of the Hoover administration for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. But also, when you're the opening act before Eleanor Roosevelt,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's kind of hard to be remembered after what Eleanor is well known for. Mm. So Lou deserves a lot more attention for the things that she did, and she had a strong life before she ever entered the White House. So I think it's important for people to be aware of that. The other is Charles Gates Dawes, who is a man who should not have been forgotten by history. And he has an interesting background, both as a banker, vice president under Coolidge, leader of the first director of the budget under Harding, a winner of a Nobel Peace Prize for reworking the reparations agreement between Germany and the Allies from World War I, an ambassador of the Court of St. James, and the first head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. An amazing, amazing man whose story has also been forgotten.
Well, can people find your books on Amazon or at their local bookstores?
They can find them on Amazon. There are also links to the directly. If you're not interested in purchasing through Amazon, AnnetteBDunlap.com, and should be able to find them that way.
Well, Annette, this has been a really enjoyable discussion, and I've learned so much about Frances Cleveland that really I want to talk more about her with other people I know and really share what I've learned, and also encourage people to buy the book, Frank. It's terrific. And I hope you have some other person in mind to write about, and that you will let us know about that so that we can have you back on our show.
I would appreciate that. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, Annette, and have a great day, okay?
Thank you, too. Okay, have a good one.
Bye, Annette. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you, whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.